Every house in town wore a crown of smoke that winter. Every house but one. At the far edge of the road, past the frozen fence posts and the snow that swallowed the world whole, sat a low cabin made of earth. No woodpile leaned against its wall. No axe rested by its door. No orange glow flickered behind the glass. By every law the cold had ever written, the children inside should have been dying. They were not. A small girl slept with her cheek against a warm stone floor, her breath slow and even. Her brother had kicked his blanket aside in the night because, for once, he did not need it. And their father sat in the dark, mending a torn glove with steady hands, listening to something no one else in town could hear. Beneath his floor, where the snow could not reach and the wind could not follow, the ground was breathing. The whole town would come knocking before the storm was through. They would beg to know his secret. He had spent everything he owned to bury it. The wagon came down the road slowly, the way a thing moves when it has nowhere left to hurry to. One tired horse pulled it. One man held the reins. And behind him, wrapped in everything they owned, sat two small children who had stopped asking how much farther. The town watched it come. They always watched in a place like that. Curtains shifted. Shop doors paused half open. A boy on a fence stopped kicking his heels against the wood and stared, because strangers were rare that late in the season. And strangers with children were a kind of sad people did not like to look at for too long. The man's name was Calder Hartwell. He was not old, but the winter in him made him look it. There was gray dust in his coat and gray sorrow in his eyes and his hands. His hands were the hands of a man who had buried something he loved and kept working anyway. Beside him sat his son. The boy, Asa, held himself straight as a fence post, trying to look like a man who could carry half his father's burden. He was too young for it, but grief had made him try, and tucked under Calder's arm, half swallowed by his worn coat, slept his daughter, Posy, 6 years old. She slept the way only small children can sleep, completely, trustingly, certain that someone awake was keeping the cold away. She did not know yet how little her father had. She only knew his arm was there, folded beneath the wagon seat, where no rain could reach it, was a gray wool scarf. It had belonged to their mother. Cora Hartwell had gone the spring before. A sickness had settled into her chest one winter and never left, and by the time the ground was soft enough to dig, the money was gone. The doctor had stopped coming, and the small home they once rented had a new family living in it. All Calder carried out of that life was a toolbox with a broken handle, 2 children, and a scarf that still, if he let himself believe it, smelled faintly of her. He did not let himself believe it often. The wagon stopped in the middle of town. A man was already waiting for him there. Thaddeus Vance was the kind of rich a small town breeds when one family controls the grain. He wore a good coat. He had a good belly under it. And he had the smile of a man who had already decided how a conversation would end before it began. "You'd be the one looking for land," Vance said. It was not a question. Calder climbed down stiff from the cold. "I would." Vance had land, of course. He had a good deal of it. But the parcel he steered Calder toward was the parcel no one else would take. Out past the edge of everything, where the wind came down off the open ground with nothing to slow it, where the dirt was full of shale and the trees grew nowhere near. "Nothing much will grow out there," Vance admitted, "because a lie told near the truth is the easiest kind. But for a man with little, it's something." Then he named his price. It was too high. Both men knew it was too high. Vance watched the stranger's tired face and waited for the wince, the bargaining, the small humiliations a desperate man performs to save a few dollars. They did not come. Calder looked out toward the empty land for a long moment. The wind moved across it like a hand smoothing a sheet, and something in his face, something Vance did not understand and did not like, eased. "I'll take it," Calder said. Vance smiled wider, certain now that he had won. He did not know what he had just sold. The townspeople had opinions. Towns like that always did. Some said the widower was a fool. Some said he was already beaten, that you could see it on him, that the children would be the ones to pay for it. A few said nothing at all, which was its own kind of judgment. And from behind a window edged with frost, an old woman watched the wagon roll out toward the worthless ground. Her name was Adeline Crow. She had buried a husband of her own years back, and a softness with him. What was left was sharp. She missed very little, and she forgave even less, and she had long ago stopped expecting men to know what they were doing. She watched the little girl's head bob against her father's coat as the wagon jolted over the ruts. "Those children," Adeline said quietly, to no one but the cold glass, "won't see the worst of winter." She said it the way some people say hard things, not with cruelty, but with the weary certainty of someone who has seen the ground take more than its share. Then she let the curtain fall. Out on the empty land, Calder unhitched the horse as the light went thin and blue. There was no house. There was nothing but ground and wind and the long grass bent flat by the cold. Asa stood close, trying not to shiver, looking at the place that was supposed to be home and seeing only emptiness. "There's nothing here, Pa," the boy said. It was not a complaint. It was almost a question, a small, frightened hope that his father would tell him otherwise. Calder did not answer right away. He walked a little way off, past where the wagon stood, out toward a low dip in the ground near a dry creek bed. The others watched him go, and then, slowly, the man knelt down in the frozen dirt. He pressed his bare hand against the top of the soil. It was hard there, sharp with frost, dead as iron. But he did not stop at the top. He dug his fingers down, past the brittle crust, into the dark earth beneath. And he went still. The way a man goes still when he hears something far off that no one else has noticed yet. Down there, below the frost, the ground was not dead. It was cold, yes, but it was a steady cold, an even cold, a held thing, the way a deep cellar holds the memory of a summer long after the summer is gone. And Calder remembered a voice, not his own, hers. A winter passed when the sickness was still small and they still believed it would pass. Cora had told him about a root cellar from when she was a girl, how the world above could freeze solid and crack the trees apart, and down in that dark the potatoes never knew. How the earth kept its own warmth, low and quiet and faithful, no matter what the sky was doing. Build something the cold can't reach, she had said once, half asleep, not knowing she was leaving him an inheritance. He had not understood it then. He was beginning to understand it now. Calder pressed his palm flat against the dark soil, and for the first time since the spring he had put her in the ground, the corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, but it was close. Behind him, Posy had woken in the wagon. She sat up, rubbing her eyes, looking at the empty land and the gray sky and her father kneeling in the dirt like a man at prayer. "Pa," she called. "Are we home?" Calder stood. He brushed the dark earth from his hands, but slowly, almost gently, the way you set down something you mean to come back to. He looked at the worthless ground that the rich man had been so pleased to sell him. He looked at the place where the wind came hardest, and he looked, last of all, at his 2 children, the only reason left in the whole cold world for a man to keep going. "Not yet," he said, then quieter, so quiet the wind nearly took it. "But it will be." He did not build a wall that day. He did not raise a roof or stack a single board. He took up the shovel with the broken handle, walked out to the edge of the land where the cold blew strongest, and he began, against all the laughing town would do, to dig. The first thing the town learned about Calder Hartwell was that he dug before he built. And the town did not understand it at all. A man came to empty land with winter breathing down his neck, and what did he do? He did not raise a wall. He did not lay a floor. He did not even pitch a proper shelter for those 2 children of his. He picked up a shovel, and he opened the ground. He cut long channels into the frozen dirt, out where the wind came hardest, 4 of them, running side by side like the ribs of some great buried animal. Each one stretched far longer than a grave. Each one dropped deeper than a man stood tall, then sloped down, gentle and deliberate, towards small pits he lined with flat stone. From the road, it made no sense. People slowed their horses to look. They came out of their way to look. Word travels fast in a place with little else to talk about, and the word was this: the widower on the bad land had lost what was left of his mind. Planning to crawl underground when the snow comes? A ranch hand called out one afternoon, grinning down from his saddle. Calder did not look up. He set the next shovelful aside, measured the slope with his eye, and kept on. The man laughed and rode away, and the laughter was the kind that gets repeated in a warm room later, with the cold pressing on the windows and everyone glad to have someone to feel above. They called the trenches grave sites. They were not wrong to think of graves. The shape was close enough, but they were wrong about whose. The children worked beside him. Asa carried loose stone in a feed sack that was always a little too heavy, his thin arms shaking by the end of each day, his face set hard against complaint. He had decided, in the quiet way children decide things, that his father would not carry this alone. Posy gathered dry grass and bundled it with twine, her small fingers going red and clumsy in the cold, strands of hair whipping across her face. She sang to herself sometimes, little songs with no real words, and the sound of it carried thin across the empty ground. It was the only warm thing out there. By nightfall, Calder could barely straighten his back. His palms split open during the second week. The blood dried dark on the shovel handle, and he wrapped them and kept going. because the cold was not going to wait for his hands to heal. One evening, when he finally lowered himself down beside the small fire with those ruined hands trembling, Asa came to him. The boy did not say anything. He took the gray scarf, his mother's scarf, from where it was kept, and he wound it slowly, carefully, around his father's torn palms. Calder went still. For a moment the firelight caught something in his eyes that he did not let fall. "Your mother," he said at last, his voice rough, "would have told me to wear gloves." Asa almost smiled. "She told you that a lot." "She did." Calder looked at the dark trenches stretching out into the night. "I never listened." It was the closest the two of them came to speaking of her. And it was enough. A mile out from the heart of town stood a salvage yard. It was a crooked place, a maze of broken machinery and warped barrels, rusted stove parts, and scrap metal leaning against fences that leaned right back. The man who owned it was named Otis Bell, and Otis had a low opinion of most things and a lower opinion of most people, which suited the trade just fine. That was where Calder went. Not to the lumber yard, where an honest builder would go. To the heap of rust and ruin where a man went only when he had no money and no shame about it. He moved through the piles for hours. He pulled out bent stovepipes and cracked clay flue. He dragged free-dented tin and old oil drums blackened with smoke and grease. He laid them out on the frozen ground and studied them the way another man might study a horse before buying. Otis finally wandered over, wiping his hands on a rag that made them no cleaner. "Building a barn out there?" Otis asked. "Or a scrap heap to match this one?" Calder lifted a length of twisted pipe and turned it in the gray light. "Something that moves air," he said. Otis squinted. "Above ground or below?" "Below." The old man let out a sound that was half a cough and half a laugh. "You aim to heat a house with buried chimney pipe." He shook his head slowly. "Mister, I've heard a lot of foolishness across this yard. That's near the top. Most men would have argued, would have explained, defended, tried to make the stranger see. Calder did not. He only said what mattered. The pipe doesn't need to hold water. It doesn't need to be pretty. It needs length. So the cold air has somewhere to travel before it reaches the house. The metal carries the temperature. The earth holds it. The moving does the rest." Otis stopped laughing. He looked at the stranger a moment longer, and something shifted behind his squint. Not belief, not yet, but the surprise of a man who expected nonsense and got a reason instead. "Huh," Otis said. Then he named a price that was barely more than the weight of the metal, because a strange idea spoken plainly was worth something to a man who lived among ruined things. By that evening, the story had reached the warm rooms of town. The widower on the bad land was going to survive the winter, they said, by heating his house with pipes buried in the dirt, like a fool burying his own coffin. And in the corner of one such warm room, a rich man listened, and did not laugh with the others. Thaddeus Vance did not like to be made a fool of. He had sold the widower the worst land he owned, at the best price he'd ever gotten for it, and he had felt very fine about that for a few days. A clean win. A stranger's desperation turned to coin. But now there was talk. Talk that the stranger had not been beaten at all. Talk that he was doing something out there. Something nobody understood. And a thing nobody understands is a thing that makes a man like Vance uneasy. Because if the worthless land turned out to be worth something, Then Vance had not been the clever one in that deal. He had been the one who didn't see it. So Vance did what men of his kind do. He did not pick up a shovel and go learn. He picked up his influence, the soft, heavy weight a man carries when he controls the grain, the credit, the small daily mercies of a town. And he leaned on it. He went to Otis Bell. "That scrap you've been selling the widower," Vance said in the easy tone of a man who has never once been told no. "I'd take it kindly if it dried up." Otis looked at him a long moment. "It's my scrap." "It is," Vance smiled. "And it's my grain your customers eat through the winter, my credit at the store. Funny how a town leans on a few men." He let it sit. "I'd hate to see anyone caught short." It was not a threat. It was worse than a threat. It was a reminder, gentle as a hand on the shoulder, of exactly how much one man could make life harder for everyone Otis knew. And it did not stop there. Vance was good with words. The kind of words that sound like concern and cut like a blade. In the store, on the church steps, wherever people gathered, he let his worries show. "Those poor children," he would say, shaking his head. "Out there in the open while their father digs holes. No proper roof on them yet. A man grieving his wife. Well, grief makes a person strange, makes him forget what matters." A pause, a sigh. "Somebody ought to look in on those little ones, for their sake." He never said Calder was unfit. He only said it loud enough, soft enough, often enough, that the town began to wonder it for him. Out on the land, Calder felt the cold turn sharper than the weather. Otis came one gray morning, and the wagon behind him was near empty. "Can't sell you much more," the old man said, and he could not quite meet Calder's eyes. "It's not me. It's how it is." Calder understood. He had lived in enough towns to know how a powerful man's displeasure traveled. He looked at the half-empty wagon, at the work still left undone, and he felt the size of what was being taken from him. "It's enough," he said. It was not enough. They both knew it. But Calder Hartwell had learned, in the hardest spring of his life, that you do not weep over what is taken. You count what is left, and you make it carry the load. He unloaded the little there was, and he went back to digging. Then the rain came. Not snow. Worse than snow. A freezing rain, the kind that falls as water and lands as ice, the kind that sheathes every blade of grass in glass and turns the world to something cruel and beautiful and dangerous all at once. And it found the weakness in his work. Calder had laid the pipe through the trenches, sealing each joint with pine resin warmed over the fire, strips of oilcloth, twisted wire, clay mixed thick with horsehair so it would not crack when the ground went hard. He had set the intake low behind a rough fence where the cold would gather. He had done it with care. But care is not the same as knowing. That first night, as the freezing rain ticked against the unfinished walls, he noticed the air change. The current moving up from the buried pipe had been dry, faint but dry, and steady. Now it slowed. It thickened. A damp, earthy smell crept up from the outlet. The smell of a cellar gone wrong. Calder knelt by the vent and felt it with the back of his hand. The air had gone wet, and wet air would not carry warmth. Wet air would carry the cold straight into the house and lay it down like a second winter. One length of pipe had settled too flat in the ground. Water was pooling where it should have run. The whole system was choking on its own breath. He went out into the freezing rain with a lantern. There was no choice, and choices are simple things when there is only one. He opened the trench again by lantern light while the rain turned to ice on his coat and the wind came across the open ground hard enough to sting the breath out of him. The mud was half frozen. It fought the shovel. His hands, just beginning to heal, split open again under the handle, and the cold was a mercy in that, at least. It numbed what it broke. Asa came out to him. The boy should have been asleep, but he had heard his father go, and he could not stay warm knowing the man was out in that. So he came and stood at the edge of the open trench, holding the lantern with both hands so the light would not shake. For a long while neither spoke. The rain hissed. The shovel bit and lifted, bit and lifted. Down in the trench, Calder coughed. A deep cough that he tried to swallow and could not. And the fear that the boy had been holding back for weeks, the fear he had been too brave to say, finally broke loose. Pa. His voice was small under the wind. What if it doesn't work? Calder stopped. He stood there a moment in the dark and the wet, up to his knees in the cold earth, an exhausted man with a dead wife and 2 living children, and a town that wanted him to fail. He could have lied. Fathers lie sometimes and call it kindness. He did not. If it doesn't, he said quietly, looking up at the boy and the small, steady light, then winter will tell us soon enough. It was not comfort, but it was the truth, and the boy seemed to need the truth more than he needed comfort, because something in his shoulders settled. He gripped the lantern tighter. He stayed, and down in the freezing mud, Calder found the flat place in the pipe, and he raised it, and he packed the earth beneath it, new. And slowly, slowly, the choking eased. By the time the gray dawn came, the air moving up from the ground was dry again. Faint, but dry. It would have to be enough. Posy had slept through all of it, curled in the wagon under her mother's blankets. When she woke, she found her father sitting against the unfinished wall, gray-faced, his split hands wrapped in the scarf, watching her brother feed the small morning fire. You're all muddy, Pa, she said, frowning. I am, he agreed. Did you fix it? He looked at her for a moment. This small, bright thing in the middle of so much cold. I think so, he said. We'll know when it's cold enough to matter. Posy considered this with the great seriousness of the very young. Then she climbed down, patted over, and put her small hand against his cheek, which was as far from warm as a cheek could get. You should sleep, she told him, and Calder Hartwell, who had not let himself rest in days, closed his eyes. Because when a child commands you to live, you find it harder to refuse. The story of the failed pipe traveled the way the stories always did. Most heard it and laughed again, comfortable in the knowledge that the fool had nearly drowned his own foolishness in a ditch. But one man did not laugh. Captain Croft was old now, but he had not always been. He had spent his younger years around rail depots and supply camps and the long, cold edges of the country, in places where the difference between a warm night and a dead man came down to small things. A slope, a seal, a draft, the angle of a wall against the wind. He understood, the way few in that town could, that coal did not kill with drama. It killed with mistakes. And so, one gray afternoon, while the town waited for the next chapter of the widower's downfall, Captain Croft rode out to the Badland to see the thing for himself. The town expected him to come back with a story to tell. They were right. Just not the story they wanted. Croft did not laugh when he dismounted. He walked the property slowly, in silence, the way a man walks a thing he means to judge fairly. He looked at the direction of the intake, set low behind the fence where the cold would pool. He looked at the depth of the trenches and the angle of the slopes. He crouched and put his hand near the outlet and felt the faint, dry current moving up out of the ground. Calder stood back and let him look. He had been mocked enough to know the difference instantly between a man come to laugh and a man come to understand. This was the second kind, and the second kind frightened him more, though he could not yet say why. Croft straightened at last. He brushed the dirt from his gloves. "It has logic," the old man said. That alone was enough to make Asa stop working and stare. No one had said such a thing. Not once. But Croft was not finished. "The frost here goes deeper than you're used to," he said, his voice level, neither cruel nor kind. "The moisture will fight you at every turn. You've seen that already." He glanced toward the low, half-finished walls. "And air alone may never carry enough warmth through the worst of it. You've built something clever. I'll grant you that. But clever and enough are not the same thing." Then his eyes moved, past Calder, past the trenches, to the little girl gathering grass in the cold, and the boy with his red, chapped hands. And his voice dropped, and lost its steadiness, and became something else entirely. "You're gambling 2 children," Croft said quietly, "against an idea." The wind moved across the open ground between them. It was not mockery. Mockery Calder could have shrugged off. This was worse. This was a man who knew cold, looking at his children and being afraid for them. For a long moment, Calder said nothing. Then he rested both hands on the shovel and he looked out at the buried trenches running beneath the frozen ground. And he answered, "Every house that stands through a hard winter is an idea, Captain." His voice was low. "Most men just don't know it. They burn wood and call it certainty, right up until the wood runs out." He looked at the old soldier. "I don't have wood to burn through. I don't have the money for it, and I won't have it." A pause. "So I'm not fighting the cold. I'm working with the one thing out here that never freezes all the way through." Croft held his gaze, and whatever he saw there, it did not make him smile, and it did not make him argue. He mounted his horse. He looked once more at the children, and then he rode away. And for the first time, the man who left the Badland was not laughing. That, more than anything, was what frightened Calder. Not the ridicule, the concern. Only after the buried pipe was finished did Calder begin, at last, to build the house itself. And that decision alone convinced the rest of the town that the widower was beyond saving. A man builds walls first. Everyone knows it. Walls are shelter. Walls are sense. He had spent the better part of a season opening the ground and burying rust in it, and only now, with the cold tightening its grip, did he think to put a roof over those poor children. But Calder understood a thing the town did not. Thin wooden walls bled heat into the open ground like a wound, and lumber cost money he did not have. So he did not build up, light and quick, the way the others had. He built heavy. He cut thick blocks of sod straight from the earth, and he stacked them, layer on layer, over packed dirt and shale. Between the outer wall and the inner, he left a narrow gap of dead air, a hollow space to slow the cold's crossing. He set flat stone along the lower courses, where the drifts and the wet would strike hardest. It did not look like a house. It looked like a low mound of earth that someone had hollowed out by hand. One man, riding past, called it a dirt pile, pretending to be a home. Another said it was the only house in the country already half buried before anyone had died in it. Calder heard them. He kept stacking sod. Asa packed wet clay into the seams with stiff red fingers. Posey carried armloads of dry grass for the stuffing between the walls, dropping half of it, laughing when the wind stole the rest. And in the center of the low house, above the main outlet of the buried pipe, Calder built the heart of the whole thing. A raised platform, thick slabs of flat stone, fitted close, packed underneath with clay, a place to sleep, because stone, he knew, held warmth longer than air ever could. The faint current rising from the ground would charge the rock all through the day, slow and patient. And at night, when the cold came down hardest and the air went thin, the stone would give that warmth back, not roaring heat, not fierce heat, steady heat, the kind that does not blaze and die, the kind that simply stays, hour after hour, while the world outside tries to take everything. One afternoon, while Calder set another course of sod, a carriage slowed on the road. Adeline Crow sat inside it, wrapped against the cold, watching the children smear mud along the rough walls beside their father like two small mason's apprentices. Her face tightened. She had said it before, to the cold glass of her own window. She said it again now, low, to no one. Those children will freeze before the worst of it. Calder heard her. He did not stop, and he did not look up. He only pressed the next block of earth into place, as careful as a man setting stone in a church wall, because he was not building shelter anymore. He was building something that had to survive judgment, the towns, the captains, the colds, and the only argument that would ever answer them was the one the winter itself would make. That evening, when the last of the day's wall was sealed, Posey pressed her small finger into the wet clay beside the doorway. She drew 3 little figures standing together under a square that was meant to be a roof. Then she drew a 4th, off to the side, smaller, with a line above its head that might have been a halo or might have been the sun. She did not explain it. She did not need to. By morning, the mud had hardened around all 4 of them. The first true freeze came not long after. By sundown, the water in the troughs outside the stables wore thin sheets of ice. Frost spread silver through the grass. Every chimney in town began to breathe its smoke against the darkening sky, and the warm rooms grew warm, and the people inside them felt, for a while, safe. And out on the bad land, Calder Hartwell opened the intake for the first real test. The cold air vanished down into the buried pipe. He waited. The children waited, not understanding, only knowing it mattered. And several long seconds later, a slow current rose from the outlet beneath the stone platform. Not hot, not even close to hot, but different from the killing air outside. Softer, steadier, dry instead of sharp. Calder tied a thin strip of cloth beside the vent and watched it stir, gentle and constant, in a draft that came from nowhere a chimney ever stood. Then he crouched by the stone, and Asa came and laid his hand flat against the slab. The boy's eyes went wide. "It isn't cold," he whispered. And that mattered more than heat ever could. Cold stone pulls the warmth out of a sleeping body all night long. Stone that is merely not cold lets a child sleep. That night, for the first time since their mother had gone into the ground, Asa and Posey slept without their coats. Calder did not sleep. He sat against the wall and watched them breathe, slow and even, in the faint warmth rising from beneath the floor. Once, the wind shifted and he felt the current weaken, and he was up at once, out in the dark, adjusting the fence, packing a seam, coaxing the thing back to life with bleeding hands. It worked, barely, by the thinnest margin, the way every living thing on hard ground works, by adapting, by fighting, by refusing to quit one more night. Near dawn, he finally sat down again beside the sleeping platform, and weak frost crept across the small window glass, and his children breathed their warm, even breaths in the dark. He was bone-tired. His hands were ruined. A rich man wanted him broken, and a good man feared he had gone too far, and a hard old woman had already half buried his children in her mind. But the stone was warm, and on the road into town, in the cold gray morning, a carriage slowed once more. Adeline Crow had not meant to look. She told herself she was only passing, but she glanced toward the low dirt house at the edge of everything, and she saw something that did not belong to that season at all. By the doorway, set out in the early light, stood a tin cup of water the children had left the night before. Every other cup in town wore a skin of ice that morning. That one had not frozen. Adeline Crow sat very still in her carriage, and for the first time, the certainty she had carried, the weary knowing she had buried those children with already, cracked, just slightly, the way thick ice cracks when something warm moves underneath it. She did not say a word. She only looked a long while at the cup that should have been frozen and was not. And then she told her driver, in a voice gone strangely quiet, to take her home. Winter came down in earnest after that, and the town learned what it was made of. Not all at once. That is not how the cold works. It comes the way grief comes, a little each day, until one morning you wake and cannot remember being warm. The chimneys never stopped breathing now. Smoke rose from every roof, day and night. Thick gray ribbons climbing into a sky the color of old iron. Inside the warm houses, the fires roared, and still the frost crept along the bedroom walls. Still the children woke coughing in the dark, because here was the cruel arithmetic of it. A fire is a hungry thing. It eats and gives back less than it takes, and the more fiercely it burns, the faster it must be fed. The town had built its safety on burning, and the cold had simply decided to burn longer than the woodpiles could last. In the grandest house, the fires ran day and night. Thaddeus Vance had wood, of course. He had more of everything than anyone. But even his stacks dropped lower each morning, and the rooms upstairs stayed cold enough to fog his breath. And he did not like the math he was beginning to do in his head. Captain Croft's fine iron stove burned hot and kept little. The heat poured up the chimney as fast as he could make it, and his grandson, a small boy who had come to live with him, shivered under blankets pulled close to the very stove that was supposed to save him. And in the smaller houses, where the wood was cheap and green and wet, the smoke did not even rise clean. It hung in the rooms. It stained the beams black. It crept into small chests and lit a cough there that would not leave. The town's doctor saw it all. She went house to house, this woman who had spent her life among the sick, and everywhere she went, she found the same things. Burning eyes, sleepless old men in rooms too dry and too hot, mothers coughing over their stoves before the sun was up. "The cold kills fast," she said once, half to herself, climbing back into the wind. "But the smoke just takes its time." And out at the edge of everything, the dirt house stayed quiet. No smoke rose from its low roof. No ash gathered against its walls. The small windows did not weep frost the way the others did. The warmth inside was never fierce. It never roared. It simply stayed. One morning, Asa woke and looked at the tin cup beside his bedroll, the same kind of cup that wore ice on every other table in the country. The water in it had not frozen. A few feet off, Posey sat wrapped in a blanket, listening to the wind scrape across the sod walls like something trying to get in. She tilted her head. She had a child's gift for noticing what grown people had stopped noticing. "Pa," she said, "why doesn't our house smell like burning?" Calder looked down at the slow current of warm air rising through the floor vent beneath the stone. "Because the earth," he said quietly, "doesn't need a fire to keep people alive." Posey thought about that. "Is the earth alive?" He almost smiled. "Down deep, where the cold can't reach. Maybe it is." Now, a lesser man might have stopped there. Survival is enough for most. To keep 2 children breathing through a hard winter would have been victory enough for any man on that land. But somewhere in those deep, cold weeks, Calder Hartwell stopped thinking about merely staying alive. He began to wonder if the thing he had built could do more than hold off death. He began to wonder if it could grow life. With leftover poles, scraps of oilcloth, and a few cracked panes of glass he had salvaged from an abandoned shed, he built a small lean-to against the southern side of the house. A little glass room, low and crooked. Nothing like the fine greenhouses in the seed catalogs that rich men in faraway places kept. The town, when it heard, found this even funnier than the pipes. A glass garden, on the bad land, in the dead of the cold. The widower had gone from foolish to mad, to something there was no word for. But Calder ran a thin branch of the warm air beneath the beds of that little room. The heat that reached there was faint. You could barely feel it with a bare hand. But it was enough, just enough, that the soil inside never froze solid the way the whole world outside had frozen. And in that soil, against all sense, things grew. It was Posy who pulled the first one, a cold, bright morning, frost on every roof in town, the world locked white and hard as far as the eye could see. And inside the little glass room, the child knelt in dark, loose, living soil and pulled up a small red root, brushing the dirt from it with her small, cold hands. She laughed. The sound of it carried, the way a child's laugh does, thin and clear across the frozen ground. And it sounded almost wrong, too alive, too green. For that season, in that place, a laughing child holding fresh pulled food was nearly a thing that should not be. By the deep of winter, while other families had gone entirely to salt pork and dried beans and bread gone stale, the Hartwell children ate fresh greens beside the supper pot. Not much. A little. But a little, in that winter, was a miracle dressed plainly. It was around this time that Adeline Crow came to the Badland for the first time. She told herself she came out of duty. An old woman checking on children, as decent people do. She did not let herself remember the cup of water that had not frozen, the small crack it had opened in her certainty. She came in her carriage, wrapped tight, her mouth set in its usual hard line. And Calder met her at the low door, dirt on his hands, and did not flinch from her the way most did. "Mrs. Crow," he said. She had expected a broken man, a grieving fool in over his head. What she found instead was a man tired to the bone, but standing, and behind him, through the doorway, a warmth that reached out into the cold and touched her face. She had not felt warmth like that since. She could not remember when. Her own house was warm, of course. She burned good wood, but it was the harsh, dry, hungry warmth of a fire, the kind that scorched your front while your back stayed cold. This was different. This wrapped around a person. This felt like something living had breathed it. Posy appeared at her father's side, the small red root still in her hand. "Would you like one?" the child asked, holding it up. "There's lots." Adeline Crow looked down at the little girl she had buried in her own mind weeks ago, and something in the old woman's chest, some long frozen thing, shifted. She did not take the root. She was not ready for that. But she crouched down, slow and stiff, until she was level with the child, and she looked at her for a long moment with eyes that had forgotten how to be gentle and were trying to remember. "You keep that," Adeline said, her voice rough. "Your father grew it for you." Then she straightened and looked at Calder, and the hardness came back over her face like ice closing over water. "You'll need more than warm dirt and a glass box," she told him. "The worst of it hasn't come. When it does, that little garden won't matter at all." "No," Calder agreed. "It won't. But the children will have eaten something green by then. And maybe they'll remember that when the worst of it comes." Adeline had no answer for that. She rode home in silence, and that night she sat by her own roaring fire, warm on one side and cold on the other. And she found herself thinking about a kind of warmth she had felt for only a moment, in a doorway, on the Badland. But not everyone who looked at that glass room saw a miracle. Thaddeus Vance rode past it one morning and slowed his horse, and what he felt was not wonder. It was fury. His own woodpiles were vanishing. His own rooms were cold upstairs. He had sold that worthless ground to a beaten stranger and pocketed the cheat of it. And now that ground was growing food in the dead of winter while his money burned to ash in his fireplaces. The worthless land was not worthless. He had not been the clever one. He had been the one who could not see. And a man like Vance cannot abide that. He cannot abide a world that makes him the fool. So the fury curdled into something colder and more patient, and Vance began, quietly, to want the dirt house to fail. Not just to be wrong. To fail. Because as long as the widower's mad idea worked, it stood as a small daily proof that all of Vance's wealth had not bought him the one thing that mattered out there. The sense to understand the ground beneath his own feet. The crisis came in the deepest part of the cold, the way the worst things always come, when a person is too tired to meet them. It began as a wrongness in the air. Calder felt it before he understood it. The current rising from the floor had thinned. The strip of cloth by the vent, which should have stirred steady all night, hung slack. The stone platform, where his children slept, cooled faster beneath his palm than it should have. Something had closed the throat of the thing. He went out into the dark with a lantern. The wind was screaming that night, low and endless across the open ground, driving the snow sideways so that the lantern light caught it in long white streaks. He followed the buried line, listening, feeling, the way a doctor feels for a pulse. And near the far end, where the cold blew hardest, he found the place where the air had stopped. Something had gotten into the pipe. Small creatures, driven half mad by the cold, had found their way into the buried line, seeking the one warm, dark thing left in all that frozen country. And there, deep in the pipe, they had nested and died and clogged the throat of the whole system solid. To clear it, a man would have to open the trench, in that wind, in that dark, with his bare hands, because no tool could reach where the blockage sat. Calder stood over the buried line a moment, and he was so tired in a way that goes past the body. He had buried his wife. He had lost everything. He had carried 2 children across a cold country and dug into worthless ground on a memory and a hope. And now the hope itself was choking in the dirt, and the only way to save it was to climb down into the freezing mud with his ruined hands and pull death out of the pipe by the fistful. Asa found him there. The boy had a way of always finding him in the worst hours. He came with no coat fully buttoned, his face white in the lantern glow, and he understood at once what had to be done and what it would cost. "Let me," Asa said. "My hands are smaller. I can reach—" "No." Calder's voice left no room. "Hold the light. Keep it steady. That's how you help me." He could not let the boy go down into that. A father carries what he can, so his children don't have to. That is nearly the whole of it. That is nearly all the word means. So Calder lowered himself into the open trench, into mud half frozen and clinging, and he reached into the dark pipe with bare hands gone numb almost at once, and he began to clear it. The wind howled. The snow came sideways and stung his face raw. His fingers found the cold blockage and pulled again, the work slow and blind and terrible. While above him, Asa held the lantern with both arms locked so the light would not waver. his small jaw set against the wind, against the fear, against the cold that was trying to take them both. "You still with me?" Calder called up between pulls. "Still here, Pa." "Good." A pull, a breath. "Talk to me, so I know." And the boy talked. He talked about anything. About the red root Posey had pulled. About a bird he'd seen. About nothing at all. A thin stream of a child's voice going out into a screaming dark. The way a person sings in a frightening place to prove the dark has not won yet. Down in the mud, the man worked by the sound of his son's voice. And at last, the blockage came free, and a slow breath of dry air sighed up out of the cleared pipe, and the thing was alive again. But it had cost. When Calder climbed out of the trench, he could not feel his hands at all. He sat in the snow a moment, just sat, while his son wrapped the gray scarf around those frozen, bleeding fingers, the same way the boy had wrapped them weeks before. "It's working again," Asa said, almost a question. "It is." Calder looked at the buried line, dark beneath the white. "But it's tired, son. The ground gives, but it doesn't give forever. We've been pulling warmth out of it all winter." He understood now, a thing he had not let himself fully see. The system was not magic. It had never been magic. It was a living arrangement between a man and the earth. And like every living thing, it could be exhausted. The deep warmth he had counted on was not bottomless. The hardest part of the winter was still ahead, and the ground beneath his floor was already beginning to tire. So he made the hard choice a man makes when there is not enough to go around. He shut the branch to the little glass garden. The greens would freeze. So be it. A child cannot eat a turnip if a child has frozen in the night. He shut the secondary vents, one by one, sealing off every part of the house but the one that mattered. He hoarded all the failing warmth of the earth and drove it toward a single place, the stone platform where his children slept. And from that night on, he barely slept at all. He would sit beside the stone in the dark, and every little while he would press his palm flat against it, reading its warmth like a man reading a sick child's brow. As long as the stone held warmth, his children lived. If the stone went cold, he did not finish that thought. He only kept his hand on the stone and kept the watch, hour after hour, night after night. It was in those long watches that the memory came back to him whole. He had been keeping it at a distance for months. A man cannot work and grieve at once. He must choose, and Calder had chosen the work. But in the dark, with his hand on the warm stone, and his children breathing slow beside him, the wall he had built around her gave way. And he remembered, not her sickness, not the end. He remembered her before all that, in the good years, the way she would talk in the half-sleep before dreams took her, when her guard was down, and her whole soft heart came out. She had grown up poor, poorer than him even. And she used to tell him about the root cellar her family had kept, dug deep into a hillside, and how she had loved it as a child. How the world up top could freeze hard enough to split the trees, and you could climb down into that dark, and the cold simply could not follow. How the earth kept its own warmth, low and faithful, like a secret it would only share with those who went looking. "It's the strangest thing," she'd murmured once, drifting off, his arm around her. "Everyone fights the cold, builds bigger fires, and the whole time, The answer's just down there. Quiet. Waiting. A sleepy breath. If we ever build our own place, build something the cold can't reach, promise me. He had laughed that night, half asleep himself. He had promised the way you promise sweet small things in the dark, not thinking it would ever be called in. He had not understood it then. He had not even remembered it, those first terrible months after she was gone, when grief had hollowed him out and left him too empty to think. But when he had stood on that worthless land and pressed his hand into the deep, dark soil, when he had felt the steady held warmth down where the frost could not reach, it had not been his own cleverness that knelt him down in the dirt. It had been her. It had been Cora, speaking through the years, finishing a sentence she'd begun in the warm dark of a life that was gone. Build something the cold can't reach. He had not invented this thing to save his children. He had inherited it from the only person who had ever loved all three of them at once. Calder sat very still in the dark, his hand on the warm stone, and for the first time since the spring, he let himself cry, quietly, so as not to wake them. He was not weeping for what he had lost. He was weeping because she was still here, in the warmth under his children. In the breath of the earth he had tapped on her word. In a promise made half asleep and kept, against all the world, in a house of dirt at the edge of everything. She had found a way to keep them warm after all. The watches grew longer, the cold grew deeper, and the town, all around them, began to fray. Word came out, the way it does, of how things stood, of wood piles dropping to nothing, of the smoke sickness spreading, of the doctor going house to house with less and less she could do, of fear settling over the warm rooms like frost on a window. And then, one afternoon, near the end of it, the sky changed. It had been gray for weeks, the ordinary miserable gray of deep winter. But that afternoon, the gray began to deepen and turn, low on the open ground where the weather always came from, into something else, a sickly color, a green that did not belong in any sky. The light went strange and yellow-gray, the way the light goes before something the world was not built to forgive. The wind, which had screamed for weeks, went suddenly, terribly still, and every creature on that frozen ground, the people in their warm rooms, and the cattle in their pens, and the man on the bad land with his hand on a warm stone, every one of them felt it in the same animal place, the place older than words. Something was coming, something the town had never seen and was in no way ready for. Calder Hartwell stepped out of the low door and looked at that green-gray sky, and he did not need a captain or a doctor or anyone at all to tell him what it meant. He looked at the strange light. He looked at the awful stillness. He looked at the long open ground where the worst of the weather was gathering itself. Then he went back inside to where his children slept in the borrowed warmth of the earth and their dead mother's love. He began to pack fresh earth along the door seams. He wrapped heated stones and tucked them close around the children's bedrolls. He checked the vents, the seals, the stone, everything, with hands that had stopped being able to feel weeks ago. And he stopped pretending, even to himself, that this had ever been an experiment. Asa stood watching him work. hearing the awful silence press against the walls, and the boy's voice came small in the dark. "Pa, is it the worst of it? The thing everyone said was coming?" Calder did not lie to his son. He had never lied to his son. "Yes," he said. He set the last heated stone beside Posey, who slept on, trusting, certain that someone awake was keeping the cold away. "It is." Outside, the strange green light failed toward dark, and the stillness held its breath. And somewhere out on the open ground, the storm that would test everything Calder Hartwell had built, and everything the town had failed to, gathered itself in silence, and began, at last, to move. The storm did not arrive the way the town expected. It did not build. It did not warn. The terrible stillness simply broke, all at once, into a roar that came across the open ground like something with a will of its own. The wind hit the dirt house, and the sod walls took it, low and heavy and half buried, the way a stone in a river takes the current. Above the roof, the night came apart. Snow drove sideways, so thick a person could not see a hand held out before the face. The cold dropped past anything the town had words for. And inside the low house, in the borrowed warmth of the earth, Calder Hartwell sat with his hand on the stone and waited. He had done all he could do. The seams were packed, the vents were set. The heated stones lay close around his sleeping children. Now there was only the watching, and the listening, and the long animal patience of a man who has built something, and must trust it against the worst the world can bring. The stone stayed warm beneath his palm. In the great house, the first fire died near the middle of the night. Thaddeus Vance had fed it everything. When the wood ran low, he had burned the good chairs. When the chairs were gone, he had broken up a cabinet that had belonged to his father and fed that in too, watching the carved wood blacken and curl. But the storm ate heat faster than any fire could give it. By the deep of the night, the great fireplace held only a low bed of red ash, and the cold came down through the grand cold rooms like water finding its level. And Thaddeus Vance stood in the ruin of his own warmth and understood, for the first time in his comfortable life, that his money could not buy him through this. He had a grandchild in that house, a small boy, his daughter's son, left in his care, and the boy had been shivering for hours by the dying fire, and then, a little while ago, the boy had stopped shivering. Vance was not a wise man, but even a fool knows what it means when a cold child goes quiet. Across the town, the same dark math was being worked in house after house. Captain Croft sat beside the last of his good fuel, his own grandson wrapped tight beside him, and the old soldier who had seen cold take men in far places watched the fire fail and knew exactly how little time was left. He knew something else, too. He knew of one house in all that country that had never burned a fire at all, and had stayed warm anyway. He had laughed at it once. No, he had not laughed. He had been afraid for the children in it. But he had doubted. He had stood on that bad land and told a tired man that clever and enough were not the same thing. Now his own fine certainties lay dying in the grate. Croft wrapped his grandson in everything he had, and he bent his head to the boy's ear. "We're going to walk," he said. "Just a little way. Stay with me." And he stepped out into the storm, toward the one house with no smoke rising from its roof. He was not the only one. All across that frozen town, doors opened into the howling dark, and people stepped out who had no business being out in such a night, because the alternative was to stay and wait for the cold to finish what it had started. They came on foot, bent double against the wind. They came dragging the sick and the old on sleds. The storm erased their tracks almost before they made them, and the snow blasted their faces raw. And more than one of them passed within feet of the low dirt house without seeing it, because the sod walls, half buried, blended into the white world like a thing the storm had already taken. But then one of them reached the door and knocked. Inside, Calder looked up from the stone. Asa was awake at once, pulling Posey close beneath a blanket, his eyes wide in the dark. The wind hammered the walls like fists, and again the knock came. Weaker this time, more desperate, a sound that was half a fist and half a falling body. Calder went to the door. He hesitated only a moment. He knew what opening that door would cost. Every breath of warmth he had hoarded for his children would spill out into the dark. The careful balance he had fought all winter to hold would break. Then he opened it anyway, because a man does not let people die on his doorstep to keep his own warm. Whatever else Calder Hartwell was, he was not that. Warm air spilled out into the freezing dark, not roaring heat, not the fierce, dry heat of a fire, but living warmth, soft and steady, rising from beneath the earth. And out of the storm, into that warmth, the town began to come. The doctor was first, half carrying a woman too weak to walk. Then a family, the children blue-lipped and silent. Then Captain Croft, his grandson a small still weight against his chest. Then more and more, stumbling out of the white nothing toward the one warm thing left in all the world. They did not speak as they came in. There was nothing to say that the cold had not already said for them. Pride does not survive a night like that one. It is the first thing the cold takes, long before it takes the breath. And then, last of all, a heavy figure filled the doorway, ice frozen white into his beard, a small bundle clutched against his chest. Thaddeus Vance. The man who had sold Calder the worthless land and cheated him on the price. The man who had cut off his scrap, who had whispered in the town that he was unfit, who had wished in the cold places of his own heart for this very house to fail. He stood in the doorway of the house he had mocked, and in his arms he held his grandson, and the boy was not moving. For one long moment the two men looked at each other. The storm screamed behind Vance, the warmth breathed soft behind Calder, and everything that had passed between them hung in the air. The cheat, the cruelty, the whispered words. Calder did not say any of it. He reached out, and he took the child from the old man's arms. "Bring him to the stone," Calder said. "Quick now." That was all. No accusation, no triumph. A child was dying, and a warm place was near. And to Calder Hartwell, in that moment, nothing else existed at all. They laid the boy on the warm stone platform, the very place where Posey and Asa slept. The doctor was beside him at once, her hands moving fast. Calder stripped off his own coat and wrapped it close. Asa fetched the heated stones, and Posy, woken in the chaos, did the simplest and wisest thing of all. She climbed up beside the strange cold boy and lay close against him, the way small children know to do, giving the only warmth a body has to give. For a long time, no one breathed. The wind raged. The doctor worked. Thaddeus Vance stood over the stone where his grandson lay. This man, who had never in his life been unable to buy what he needed, and he was helpless, and he knew it. Then the boy stirred, a small breath, a flutter behind the eyelids, and then, faint but real, the boy began to shiver again. That ordinary, blessed, beautiful shivering that means a body has decided to fight. The doctor closed her eyes a moment. "That's good," she whispered. "When they shiver again, it means they're fighting. He's fighting." Vance made a sound that was not quite a word. He sank down beside the stone, this big, proud man, and he put his face in his hands, and his shoulders shook, and no one in that crowded room thought less of him for it. The cold had brought them all down to the same floor. There was no high ground left in the whole world but the warm one they were standing on. By the time the last of them forced their way in out of the storm, the low house built for 3 held more than 20 souls. The air changed at once. Wet coats steamed by the walls. Melted snow dripped onto the packed dirt floor. The breath of so many people thickened the room, and children cried softly from sheer exhaustion, and the wind shook dust loose from the ceiling beams. But the house held its warmth, not fiercely, not enough to dry every coat or stop every shiver, but enough. Enough to turn the killing cold into mere misery. And misery, unlike the cold, does not end a life. Calder moved through the crowded room without panic. He shut down 2 of the secondary lines to save the deep warmth of the ground. He slowed the air through the main vent so the stone could hold its heat longer. He hung blankets from the ceiling hooks, dividing the one room into smaller pockets where the warmth of bodies could gather instead of scattering uselessly into the dark. He did not explain himself. There was no time. He simply worked the way a man works who has spent a whole winter learning the temper of the thing he built. And the people watched him. These were people who had laughed at him, who had called his home a grave, his garden madness, his whole strange labor the work of a broken mind. Now they sat in the warmth that labor had made, and they watched him save their lives with bleeding hands, and not one of them was laughing. For a few hours the house held. Then, near the deepest part of the night, Calder felt the first sign of new trouble. The stone beneath his hand cooled faster than it should. The air from the vents lost a little of its softness, and the room itself had grown heavy. Too many wet coats, too many breaths, the moisture rising and hanging and weighing the air down with the smell of melting snow and damp wool. Too many bodies, too little circulation. He knew with the cold certainty of a man who understood his own machine exactly where this went. If the balance failed, the moisture would choke the breath of the buried line, the way the freezing rain had choked it long ago. The warm house would turn into a cold box full of trapped and frightened people, and there would be no opening the door against that storm to fix it. He crouched by the main vent and listened to the air move beneath the floor. Then he looked up and found two faces in the crowd, his son and Otis Bell, the scrap man who had come in out of the storm like the rest and had been watching Calder work with the keen eye of a man who knew metal. "The outer pit's choking," Calder said quietly, so the frightened room would not hear. "The drainage, it's filling. If it stops, the line stops. Someone has to clear it." He looked at the door, and the white death screaming behind it. Otis understood at once. So did Asa, and Asa stood up before his father could choose another. "I know where it is," the boy said. "I helped dig it. I know it better than anyone but you. And you can't go. They need you in here. You're the only one who can read the stone." It was true. Every word of it was true. And it was the hardest true thing Calder had ever heard. A father carries what he can so his children don't have to. But there comes a night for every father when the load is finally too big for one set of hands, and the child reaches out to take a share, and the man must let him. Calder looked at his son, really looked at him, at the boy who had held the lantern in every dark hour of that winter, who had wrapped a scarf around ruined hands, who had grown, somewhere in all that cold, into someone he had not noticed becoming a man. "Stay roped to Otis," Calder said, his voice rough. "Stay roped to him no matter what. You clear it, and you come straight back. You understand me? Straight back." "I will, Pa." Calder gripped the boy's shoulder, hard, the way you grip a thing you are terrified to let go of. "Come back to me," he said. It was not an order. It was a prayer. And then he opened the door, and his son and the old scrap man went out into the storm, roped together, two small dark shapes swallowed almost at once by the white. The room behind them held its breath. Adeline Crow sat in the corner of that crowded warmth, and in her arms she held Posy, who had been moved from the stone to make room for the sick. The little girl had fallen asleep again, against the old woman's chest, her small hand curled in the gray wool of her mother's scarf. Adeline looked down at the sleeping child. She thought of the day she had passed this bad land in her carriage and pronounced with such weary certainty that these children would not see the worst of the winter. She had been so sure. She had buried them in her mind to spare herself the pain of hoping. And now the worst of the winter had come, and the child slept warm in her arms, in a house of dirt that had outlived every fine fire in the town. The old woman pulled the scarf tighter around the little girl's shoulders, and something that had been frozen in Adeline Crow for a very long time, longer than this winter, longer than she could name, began slowly, quietly, to thaw. She had been so certain about so many hard things. She had been wrong about all of them. Across the room, the man whose worthless land had been laughed at by the whole town knelt by a vent in the floor, reading the breath of the earth with his hand, and Adeline understood at last what she had been looking at all winter and refusing to see. Not a fool, a father doing the only thing he knew how to do for the people he loved. The minutes that Asa was gone were the longest of Calder Hartwell's life. He could not go to the door to watch. He had work that only he could do, balancing the failing warmth, slowing the air, holding the crowded house together by feel. So he worked, and he listened past the storm for a sound he could not possibly have heard. And every part of him that was not a father was screaming. Out in the white, Asa and Otis found the pit by memory and touch. It was choking, just as Calder had said, clogged with ice and the wet weight of the melt. They could not see their own hands. The wind tried to peel them off the earth and throw them into the dark. But the boy knew the ground, knew it the way you only know a thing you helped dig with your own raw hands, and he found the throat of the drain, and together they cleared it. It was brutal work, blind work, the kind of work that asks more than a body has, and takes it anyway. But beneath the frozen ground, the buried line needed to breathe, and every life in that warm house depended on it. And then it was clear. The drain ran free. The line drew breath, and two small dark shapes turned back toward a house they could not see, following a rope and a memory through the screaming white. When the door opened and Asa stumbled in, half frozen and grinning, Otis at his back. Calder crossed that crowded room faster than he had moved all night. He took his son by the shoulders. He looked at his face, his hands, made sure of him, made sure he was whole and real and breathing. And then he pulled the boy hard against his chest and held him there, and did not let go, while the warmth of the house breathed soft around them both. "I came back, Pa," Asa said, muffled against his father's shoulder. "Like you said." "You did." Calder's voice broke on it. "You did." The house held. The air cleared. The stone warmed again. And one by one, through the worst of that long night, the people in that crowded room felt the killing cold pull back from the door, beaten, for now, by a thing it could not understand. The doctor moved among them, and where there had been dying, she found mending. The sick woman breathed easier. An old man slept without the rattle in his chest. And on the warm stone, two small boys lay side by side now, Croft's grandson and Vance's, both of them shivering, both of them fighting, both of them against every expectation of that terrible night, alive. Captain Croft sat by the vent for hours, watching the warmth rise from the floor without smoke, without spark, without a single thing burning anywhere. He had told this man that clever and enough were not the same thing. He had been wrong. And near the worst hour of the night, in the warm, crowded dark, Thaddeus Vance crossed the room to where Calder knelt by the stone, and he stood there a long moment, this proud, broken man, before he could make himself speak. "How did you know?" Vance said at last, his voice low and raw. "How did you know this would work?" The room had gone quiet. Even the children seemed to listen. Everyone there wanted the answer, wanted the secret, the certainty, the genius that had saved them all while their fires died. Calder sat back slowly beside the warm stone. For a long moment he said nothing at all. The wind raged against the walls. His hand rested on the stone where his children and two strangers' children slept warm. Then he told them the truth. "I didn't," he said. Vance stared at him. "You didn't." "No." Calder looked at the floor, at the warmth rising from the dark earth beneath them all. "I didn't know it would work. I hoped. I tried. I fixed it every time it broke, and it broke a great many times." He shook his head slowly. "I'm no genius. I never was." He pressed his palm flat against the warm stone. "I just stopped trying to beat the cold," he said. "Everyone here built bigger fires, fought it, burned everything they had to push it back." He looked up, and his tired eyes moved across the crowded, breathing room. "I didn't fight it. I went looking for the one thing out here that the cold never reaches. And I worked with that instead." Silence. It was not the answer they had wanted. They had wanted a hero with a secret. What they got was a tired man who admitted he had never been sure of anything and had saved them all anyway. And somehow, that was bigger. Because every soul in that warm room understood, in that moment, that they had been saved not by genius, not by wealth, not by certainty, but by a grieving man's stubborn willingness to try a humble thing and to keep mending it with his bare hands every single time it failed. No one spoke for a long while after that. There was nothing left to say that the warm breath of the earth was not already saying for all of them. Outside, the storm screamed on into the dark. But inside the low house of dirt, more than 20 people the cold had marked for dead lay warm and breathing in the steady living heat that rose from the ground. A heat one man had found because his dying wife had once told him, half asleep, to build something the cold could not reach. And he had. The storm did not fade. It simply stopped. After so many hours of that endless roar, the silence came so suddenly that it woke people from where they slept. They lifted their heads in the crowded warm dark and listened. And for a long moment, they were more frightened by the quiet than they had ever been by the noise. Because quiet, after a night like that one, can mean a great many things. It can mean peace. It can mean the worst has passed, and the morning is safe to meet. Or it can mean there is no one left outside to make a sound at all. Calder Hartwell rose from beside the stone where he had kept his watch. His whole body ached in ways he had stopped noticing days ago. His hands, wrapped in the gray scarf, had gone past pain into a kind of distant numbness. But he rose, because someone had to be the first to learn what the silence meant. And it was his door, and these were the people sheltering under his roof. He went to the door and pushed. The snow had drifted high against it in the night, and for a moment the door would not give at all. He set his shoulder to it. He pushed again. And at last the snow shifted, and the door swung inward, and the cold, clean light of morning spilled across the crowded faces inside. It was a pale light, thin, almost gentle, the light of a world that had survived something it had no right to survive. Calder stepped out into it, and the town, what little of it could be seen, lay buried beneath the white. The drifts stood higher than a person in places. The fences had vanished completely. Here and there a roof had given way under the weight in the night, the broken beams thrust up out of the snow like the bones of something that had not made it through. And from the chimneys, from nearly every chimney in that whole frozen country, no smoke rose at all. There was nothing left in any of them to burn. The fires the town had trusted, the fires they had fed their good chairs and their cabinets and their certainty into all winter long, had gone out in the dark, one after another, all across the land, every fire but the one that had never been lit. The low house of dirt, with no smoke above it, had outlasted them all. One by one, behind Calder, the people came out into the morning. They stepped from the low door into the pale light, blinking, stunned, half disbelieving the fact of their own breath. More than 20 of them, people who, by every hard law the cold had ever written, should have been lying still and silent in their own dark houses by now. They stood in the deep snow, and they looked at the buried town. And then they turned and looked back at the low mound of earth they had spent the night inside. The house they had called a grave, a dirt pile, the work of a broken, grieving mind. And not one of them could find a single word to say. The sick woman the doctor had half carried in walked out now under her own strength, slow but steady. The old man whose chest had rattled all winter breathed the clean cold air and did not cough. And Croft's small grandson laughed at something his sister whispered to him, a bright, thin sound, and the laugh rang out across the white and seemed almost impossible after such a night. A sound too alive for a morning that should have held only grief. Captain Croft stood a long while in the snow, saying nothing. The old soldier had spent the better part of his life learning the ways the cold could take a person. He had ridden across hard country in hard seasons, and he had seen good men die of small mistakes, and he had thought, with all the weight of those years, that he understood the cold better than any man in that town. He had ridden out to this bad land once, and he had looked at a tired widower's strange buried pipes, and he had said gently, with all his hard-won certainty, that clever and enough were not the same thing. He had been wrong, and Croft was old enough and good enough to know that there is no shame in being wrong about a thing. The only shame is in being shown the truth and refusing, out of pride, to take it in. He crossed the snow to where Calder stood, and he did not offer an excuse, and he did not reach for praise. He simply put out his hand. Calder looked at it a moment. Then he took it, and the two men shook hands in the cold, bright morning. The grip of two people who had finally come to understand one another, with nothing left that needed saying. "I'd like to learn it," Croft said quietly. "Properly, not to copy what you've done, to understand why it works. That," Calder said, "is the only way it ever does." The old man nodded slowly, as though he had known that would be the answer, and had needed to hear it spoken aloud all the same. Thaddeus Vance came out of the house last of all. He had his grandson by the hand now. The boy was walking. The boy was warm. The boy was alive, breathing the cold morning air, because of a man Vance had spent the whole long winter trying to break. The two men stood facing each other in the snow. There was so much that might have been said in that moment. The cheat of the land sale, the price that was no price but a cruelty, the scrap cut off out of spite, the whispered words in the warm rooms, the slow, patient campaign to turn a grieving father into a fool in the eyes of the whole town. Calder said none of it. He had a strange mercy in him, the mercy of a man who has buried someone he loved and learned, in the hardest way there is, that grudges weigh far more than they are ever worth carrying. He looked at the proud old man, and he looked at the small boy holding tight to his hand, and what rose in him was not triumph. It was only relief, plain, weary relief, that a child had lived to see the morning. "He'll be all right," Calder said, with a small nod toward the boy. "Keep him warm a few days. Broth, if you have it. Let him sleep. He'll be all right." Vance opened his mouth and closed it again. He was not a man who had ever learned how to say the words that were trying to come up out of him now. The words of a person who has been wrong about everything that matters and has just had his own blood handed back to him alive by the very man he wronged. So he did not say them. Not that morning. He only nodded, his eyes bright and wet in the cold light, and he turned and led his grandson home across the deep snow. But something had broken in him in the night. And sometimes a thing has to break all the way through before anything better can take root in the space it leaves behind. The thaw, when it finally came slowly. The town spent long weeks digging itself back out of the white, digging paths between the houses, digging the buried fences free, digging the broken roofs clear of snow before they could be mended, digging, too, the harder graves. For not every soul in that country had been as fortunate as the ones who had reached the low dirt door in time. There was grief in those weeks. Real grief. The kind a town carries together. But underneath the grief, something else was moving. Something was changing in the bones of the place. The town had spent a whole winter laughing at one man. And then they had spent a single night being saved by him. And a thing like that does not leave a place the way it found it. People who had called the dirt house a grave now made the long walk out to it, hats held in their hands, to ask the widower how it had been done. And Calder taught them. He never asked a coin for it. He never once called himself an inventor, or a clever man, or a hero, though there were those who tried to hang those words on him now. He would only walk a man out across his own land and crouch down in the dirt with him and press his bare hand into the soil and listen to the way the wind crossed the open ground. And then he would explain, plainly and slowly, what one hard winter had taught him. He told them the truth every time, that it had broken on him again and again, that he had failed and dug it up and failed again, that there had been nights he had not known if any of it would hold. He did not pretend it had been easy. He had learned that pretending only set a man up to fail the same way Vance had. Otis Bell stopped selling his scrap as mere scrap. The old man had always had a good eye for metal. Now he had a better one for a good idea, and he began to shape the pieces that people needed. The fittings, the collars, the vents, the careful parts of the thing that Calder had once cobbled together from a junk heap by hand. The two of them made an unlikely pair, the patient widower and the gruff old scrap dealer, but they worked well together, the way two honest people usually do once they stop expecting the worst of each other. Captain Croft was among the first to dig his own, but he did it the way Calder had told him to do it. He went deep. He set his slopes true. He drained his lines carefully so that the wet could never gather and choke them in the night. He laid the flat stone beneath his floors so that it could drink the warmth by day and give it back by dark. He did not treat it as a trick to be stolen. He treated it as a thing to be understood all the way down, and when the next hard cold came, his house held. His grandson slept warm, and the old soldier never once lit the fine iron stove that had so nearly failed them both. He kept it polished in the corner, not for warmth, but as a reminder of how wrong a confident man can be. And then there was Vance, Thaddeus Vance, who could not abide being the fool, who could not bear, in the deepest part of himself, that the worthless land had turned out worth more than all his grain, and all his credit, and all his careful wealth. He did exactly what a proud man does when his pride has been wounded. He tried to do it himself, quietly, without asking, without learning. He set his workers to digging beneath one of his large storage buildings, copying what he thought he had seen in the low dirt house, but he was impatient. He wanted his standing in the town back, and he wanted it quickly, and so the trenches went in too shallow, and the pipes ran too short, and the drainage, the slow, patient, unglamorous drainage that Calder had once cleared with his bare, bleeding hands in the freezing mud, that Vance left out almost entirely. He could not see why it mattered, and so he left it out. When the first hard cold of the next season came, his copy failed. The moisture pulled into the shallow lines and froze there solid in a single night. By morning, the great storage building stood colder inside than the open air. The very thing Vance had built to prove that he understood had proven, instead, and for all to see, that he did not. And that failure taught the whole town the lesson that mattered most of all. The buried pipes had never, ever been the secret. A man could copy the pipes exactly and freeze just the same. The secret had never lived in the metal, or the trenches, or the stone. The secret lived in the understanding, in the patience, in the humble, unglamorous willingness to listen to the ground and the wind, and to keep mending the thing again and again, every single time it broke. That could not be stolen. It could not be bought. It could only be learned, and only by a person willing, first, to admit that they did not already know. Vance stood in his failed, freezing storehouse one cold evening, looking at the frost gathered thick along his shallow pipes. For a long time, he did not move at all. Then he put on his coat, and he walked across the town, alone, through the cold and the early dark, all the way out to the low dirt house at the edge of everything. He knocked on that door for the second time in his life, but this time he had not come to be saved. This time he had come to learn. Calder opened the door, and the warm air breathed out into the cold, and the two men looked at each other across the whole long winter that lay between them. "My building froze," Vance said. There was no bluster in him now, no weight of grain or credit or influence behind the words. Just a tired old man standing in the cold. "I did it the way I thought you did it. I left things out. I thought the digging was the trick of the thing." "The digging's the easy part," Calder said. "I see that now." Vance looked down at his own gloved hands. "I've known a great many things in my life, or I've told myself I have. I never let myself see it on the times I was wrong." He drew a slow breath. "I was wrong about you. From the very first day. I sold you that ground believing I cheated a beaten man out of his last dollars, and you took the worst land in the whole country, and you grew food in it in the dead of winter, and you kept my grandson breathing on a night when all my money couldn't." He raised his eyes. "I'd like to learn it right," he said. "If you can stand to teach an old fool who tried to ruin you." For a long moment, Calder said nothing. He could have shut the door. No soul in that town would have blamed him for it. The cold has a long memory, and so did Calder, and Thaddeus Vance had earned every hard word that could have been thrown at him. But Calder Hartwell had learned, across one long and terrible winter, a thing that changed the shape of a man. He had learned that warmth shared does not run out the way fire does, that a person can hold a grudge or hold a door open, but never both at the very same time, and that the only thing harder in this world than admitting you were wrong is being met with grace in the moment you finally do. He stepped back from the doorway. "Come in out of the cold," Calder said. "We'll start with the drainage. That's where you went wrong, and it's where everyone goes wrong when they think the answer is in the digging." And Thaddeus Vance, the richest and proudest man in the town, ducked his head and stepped down into the low dirt house to be taught by the very man he had once tried to break. He did not stop at learning. In the seasons that followed, the change in him went past words. He gave back the cruel price he had taken for the land, and more besides. He used his credit, which had once been a quiet weapon, to help his neighbors dig their own warm ground before the cold came. He was not a soft man, even then, but he was a humbled one, and a humbled man can become a good one if he lives long enough to try. It was the beginning, slow and unlovely, of him becoming someone better than he had ever been. Adeline Crow became, in the months that followed, the very last person anyone in that town would have expected. She became the low house's fiercest defender. Let anyone breathe a word against Calder Hartwell now. Let anyone drag up the old jokes about graves and madness, and a man who had buried his good sense along with his wife, and they would find a sharp old woman rounding on them with a tongue that had lost not one bit of its edge. "You laughed at that man the whole winter long," she would say, her eyes flint hard. "And you'd have frozen stiff in your fine warm parlors if he'd had the good sense to laugh right back and bolt his door against you. You owe him your breath. Now mind your mouth, or I'll mind it for you." People learned, and quickly, not to say such things anywhere Adeline Crow might hear them, but it was more than defending. Something had thawed in the old widow that winter, something that had been frozen far longer and far deeper than any single season. She had buried a husband years before, and she had buried a great deal of her own softness in the same cold ground. She had decided, somewhere in the long years of her grief, that it was safer to expect the worst of the world. Because if you expect the worst, then the world can never once disappoint you. She had looked at 2 children in a passing wagon and pronounced them lost in her own mind. Not out of cruelty, but to spare herself the unbearable risk of caring whether they lived or died. And then she had held a sleeping child against her chest through the worst night of her life, in a house of dirt that should by every right have been a grave. And she had felt the frozen thing inside her own ribs begin, against her will, to give. She began to come out to the bad land often after that. She came with food at first, the way an old woman finds herself a reason to come. Then she came with mending, and with stories. And at last she came with no reason at all, which is the truest kind of coming. She would sit in the warm, low house with little Posy on her lap, telling the child the old tales, the ones from her own girlhood, working the tangles out of her hair with patient fingers. She would teach her to sew a straight seam. She would scold her gently and praise her, and be, for those long, warm hours, the grandmother that her own hard grief had never once let her become. Posy began to call her Grandma Adeline. The first time the child said it, the old woman went very still, and then she had to turn and look out the small window for a good while, and no one in that house said a single word about the brightness standing in her eyes. She had spent so many long years certain that the warmth had gone out of her life for good, and it turned out the warmth had only been waiting, the way the warmth in the deep ground waits, all through the killing cold, low and quiet and faithful, for someone with the courage to come looking for it again. There came an evening, late in the first thaw, when the two of them sat alone by the warmth while the children slept. Two people who had each buried someone they loved. They did not say a great deal. People who have carried that particular weight rarely need to. But Adeline looked at the warm floor for a while, and then she looked at Calder, and she said in a voice gone unusually soft, "It doesn't leave, does it? The missing?" "No," Calder said. "It doesn't. I used to think it would. I used to wait for it to." She shook her head slowly. "It just changes shape. That's all it ever does." Calder thought about the warmth rising from beneath his floor, about a promise made half asleep, years ago, in another life. "It changes shape," he agreed, "but it's still warm, if you let it be." The old woman did not answer, but after a while she reached over and she patted his ruined hand once, the way a person does when there are no words large enough, and that was the whole of it, and it was enough. As for Calder himself, the winter had saved his children, but somewhere in those long, dark watches beside the stone, it had begun quietly to save him too. He had come to that land a hollowed-out man. Our grief had scraped him empty as a dry well. He had been moving only because his children needed him to keep moving, breathing only because stopping was a thing he had not allowed himself. But a strange and gentle thing had happened, down in the dark, with his hand pressed flat against the warm stone, night after night after night. He had found his wife again. Not her body, not the life the two of them had lost, but her, the soft, true heart of her, the way her mind had worked, the gift she had left him without ever once knowing she was leaving it behind. Every breath of warmth that rose up through his floor was a sentence she had begun, half asleep, in the warm dark of a life that was gone, and that he had finished, years later, with his own bleeding hands. Build something the cold can't reach. He had built it, and in the building of it, he had discovered that the cold had not reached her after all. She was still here, in the warmth, in the children sleeping safe upon the stone, in the small red roots that had grown, impossibly, in a glass box in the dead heart of winter. She was in him. She always would be. One evening, Late in that first thaw, Posy found her father holding the gray scarf in his lap. He was not weeping. He was past that now. He was simply holding it, turning the soft, worn wool over in his hands. In the warm, low light of the house, her mother had reached across death itself to keep warm. That was Mama's, Posy said. It was. The child climbed up and settled beside him. Do you think she'd have liked our house? It was the same question she had asked him once, in the deep of the cold, on the night the whole town had believed they would die. But this time, Calder did not look down at his ruined hands when he answered. He looked at the warmth all around them, at the safe sod walls, at his daughter's bright, trusting, upturned face. I think, he said slowly, that your mama built this house, as much as I did, more than I did, truth be told. And he smiled, and it was a real smile now, a whole and healed thing. I only held the shovel. Posy considered this with the great seriousness of the very young. Then she reached over and took the scarf gently from his hands, and she wrapped it around her own small shoulders, the way her mother had once worn it, the way her brother had once wound it around their father's broken palms in the dark. Then she's still keeping us warm, the child said simply. And Calder Hartwell, who had been so certain the cold had stripped everything from him, learned in that moment that it had not. It had taken a great deal. He would not pretend otherwise, but it had left him this, a warm house, 2 living children, an old woman who had learned against all her own defenses to love again, a proud man learning slowly to be humble, and a whole town that had been taught the hardest way there is to look twice at the things they did not understand. The cold had taken his wife, but it had not taken a single thing she left behind. The years moved on, the way the years always do. Asa grew tall and quiet and good with his hands, and better still with his thinking. He had learned, out on that bad land, a thing most men go their whole lives without ever learning, that the ground beneath a person's feet is not an enemy to be beaten, but a thing that holds its answers ready for anyone humble enough to kneel down and ask. He grew into a young man that other towns would send for when they needed to bring warm water up through cold ground, when they needed to drain a wet field or coax the earth into giving what it would never give a man who tried to force it. People trusted his work. They said the young man had a feel for the ground that simply could not be taught, but it had been taught by a father, in the cold, by the light of a single lantern. One terrible, unforgettable winter, Posy grew up to stand at the front of a small schoolroom of her own, a teacher with her mother's soft heart and her father's patient, steady hands. And every so often, when the first frost came creeping across the windows and the children grew restless and a little afraid of the long cold waiting ahead of them, she would set aside the lessons and she would tell them a story. She would tell them about a winter once when the whole world froze hard as iron, about how every warm house in a town had burned itself hollow trying to fight the cold and win, and about how the only home that stayed warm through the worst of it was a low house of dirt built by a man the whole town had laughed at, a man who had finally stopped fighting the cold altogether and started instead to listen to the earth. She never once told the children it was true. She told it the way the oldest and best stories are always told, as a thing that lives somewhere far deeper than true. And at the very end, she would always say the same thing. A thing an old soldier had said to her father, once, long ago. A thing her father had repeated to her, gently, on his own last quiet evening, years and years later, with her hand folded warm in his, and a gray scarf resting near. Winter was never the enemy, she would tell the children, her voice soft in the warm room. It only ever asked one single thing of the people who wanted to live through it. Not to be the strongest, not to be the richest, not to be the cleverest soul in the whole town. She would smile then, the very same way her mother used to smile. Only to be humble enough, she would say, to listen. And the low house of dirt stood at the edge of that town for a great many years after. The sod walls settled lower into the earth with time. The grass grew over the buried lines until you would never have known they were there. The little glass garden caved in, one hard winter, and was never built again. But beneath the frozen ground, when the cold came down hard and the wind crossed the wide open country and the world above froze solid as iron, the warmth still moved, quiet and low and faithful. The way love moves when it has been built into something well enough and humbly enough to outlast the very hands that built it. The way a thing kept warm by an open heart will go right on keeping others warm, long after the heart that first started it has gone still. The town never did forget the man who buried pipes beneath his yard and warmed his whole home without burning a single log. But what they remembered in the end was never the cleverness of it. It was the morning that more than 20 frozen souls walked out of a house built for 3, and every one of them was alive. It was a hard old woman learning late to love a child she had already given up for lost. It was a proud, wealthy man bowing his head in a humble doorway to be taught. And most of all, it was a grieving father who discovered in the warm dark beneath his own floor that the wife he thought he had lost had never truly left him at all. The cold takes a great deal from us in this world, but it cannot take everything. Not from those who are humble enough to go looking for the warmth that always waits, low and quiet and faithful, in the deep and patient places, down where the cold has never once, in all the long years of the world, been able to reach.